Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our cultural treasure, the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture. I'm Lisa Fiore, President of the Board of Trustees for South County's oldest museum, and this year we are celebrating our 134th year. The museum's mission is education. We know the importance of early education for young children from pre-K to fifth grade. Our talented education director and our vice president, Mary Cockcroft Brown, works hand in hand with our gifted fellow board members, Louise Weaver, Linda Hennessy, Jan Rothstein, Betsy Cook, and our administrator, Julie Wardwell. Their workshops are creative, engaging, and informative. They also host the Ollie group tours of the museum gallery and walking tours of historic Peacedale Middle Village. Our wonderful evening speaker series is curated by fellow trustee Karen Ellsworth. Karen also researches and writes our first-rate newsletters. We strive to keep history alive, in particular local history. So tonight's speaker, Gerald or Ged Carbone, is familiar to many of us as a distinguished journalist for the Providence Journal. I remember seeing that name forever. Yeah. And author of A History of Brown Sharpe, a biography of George Washington, and Nathanael Greene, a biography of the American Revolution. So tonight, Ged will take us back to the late 1700s, where we will encounter Nathanael Greene and hear about the success of a man whose many peers thought was unlikely to succeed. The improbable life and legendary career of Nathanael Greene. Let's give a warm welcome to Ged.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, good evening. Thank you for coming out here. Without Nathanael Greene, there is no United States of America. Now, I can't conclusively prove that thesis, of course, but about I'm hoping that by our time here together, the end of this evening, you'll at least agree it's a reasonable thesis to put forward. And then the only other person about whom you could reasonably say that, without him there is no United States, would be George Washington. And I've written books about both of them, and I can conclusively say that of the two, Nathanael Greene was the better general. The way I got interested in this story was I was working for the Providence Journal, and Mary and I had just moved to Patuxent Village, and there was a big parade basically going through our front door, the Gaspee Days parade. And I went down to see it. The ruckus called me down there, and there was a bad speaker, not the person, but technically the speaker wasn't good, and the band was playing, but this woman was telling an interesting story about the Gaspee, but I could barely make it out. So that next year, for the Providence Journal, I'm going to write a feature story about the Gaspee, and what was that all about, So the next year came, and I wandered over to the state archives because I wanted to get some primary source documents about the Gaspee. And oh my God, it was wonderful. You go in there and they have, the king was not happy when the local settlers burned his ship, the Gaspee. He wasn't pleased about that at all. So he got a commission together to look into what happened. And the commissioners met, and somebody kept meticulous notes, transcripts, and you could read about everything that happened. And so I'm reading about it, and I noticed that the one ship that the Gaspee captured and took that caused all the ruckus was the fortune belonging to Nathanael Greene. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So who's Nathanael Greene? So I went and I looked up the papers of Nathanael Greene, and I got out volume 1 of the papers of Nathanael Greene, and I started reading. And it begins with Nathanael Greene as being this kind of good size, 5'10", kind of goofy, asthmatic, bookish son of a Quaker preacher. Like when you read his notes from prior to the Gaspee affair, he's just writing to Sammy Ward, a young friend of his, and he's mooning about the fact that Sammy's sister Nancy doesn't love him. And he was kind of a funny, clever guy, commenting on local sermons about, when the preacher at the end of it said, well, what more can be said about this? And much more than you could ever think of, thought I. So the sermon was like a whistle belly vengeance. The one who ate the most got the worst share. So he was kind of a funny, good-humored guy who really loved Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Sterne, in his novel Tristram Shandy. And he could do a perfect mimic of Dr. Schlapp, the guy who chopped off Tristram Shandy's nose. And he'd walk around and crack up people. And he was kind of a large, affable, bookish, goofy guy. And so that's how this kind of rather slim volume begins. And then I get to the end of it, and he's writing as a general from the other side of the battlefield of Trenton. He had crossed over the Delaware River with George Washington, that Charles Wilson Peale painting of, turns out Nathanael Greene's like the Forrest Gump of the American Revolution. Every time there's something big going on, he's in the middle of it. And so you get to the end of this book, one of the last letters in it, and he's writing to his wife, Katie, we crossed the Delaware at McConkey's Ferry on the 25th of instant, Christmas Day, and attacked the town by storm in the morning. It rained, hailed, and snowed, and was a violent storm. The storm of nature and the storm of the town exhibited a scene that filled the mind, and during the action, the passions easier conceived than described. The action lasted about 3/4 of an hour. We killed, wounded, and took prisoners of the enemy. So he's writing about, and he writes, this is an important period to America, big with great events. Writing basically from the field at Trenton. And I'm like, how did this happen? How did this gimp-kneed, asthmatic, bookish son of a Quaker preacher in the space of one slim volume become George Washington leading one of the columns into Trenton? And it's a fascinating story. And there are 13 volumes of this. And luckily, he's a great writer because I read them all and watched his development. So he became a guy about whom I think you can say, without him, there's no United States, who's actually a better general than Washington. So how did it happen? He's out there in, born in Potawatomi, up near Goddard Park. And he's one of 6 brothers. His father is a leader of the local Quaker meeting house. Prosperous guy, they got a dairy farm, a grist mill, but mostly where they make their money is this big forge where they smith these anchors. And I'm talking like 17-foot long anchors that they bring out to Newport for the big ships out there. And then his father started a second forge out in Coventry in the early 1770s. And of all his 6 sons, the one he wanted to go out there and run it was most capable, Nathanael Greene. So Greene went out there to run it. So he's, by working that forge, perhaps that's what gave him kind of a little bit of a gimp knee, because he was always pushing on that bellows. And his father, being a Quaker preacher, only wanted him to read Barclays and Fox and the scriptures, nothing else. But it was his father's lot to have a son who just loved to read. It was kind of, if I had a kid that liked video games, I'd be like, Greene loved to read. And one of his aunts said of him, nobody could get the substance of a book the way Nathanael Greene could. So he's out there writing in the early 1770s. He's getting into his late 20s. By now, you've already had a lot of troubles with Britain, the Stamp Act, some nasty stuff, the Intolerable Acts. And Greene doesn't ever once write about this in his early letters. He's writing to Sammy Ward about, and funny observations about preachers and things like that, but not at all concerned until the Gaspee takes his ship in 1772. And then he writes to Sammy Ward in his own words, I became obsessed with the cause. And Nathanael Greene wanted justice for Lieutenant Dundingston, who took his ship. And his idea of justice was to bring him to court up in East Greenwich, and he did. He filed a suit against him and actually won that suit. But of course, some other Rhode Islanders had a different idea of justice for Lieutenant Dundingston, and they decided to burn his ship in June of 1772. And that's when you start to see Nathanael Greene get interested in the troubles between England and what became the United States. And he files that suit against Studington, and then he goes around town, around East Greenwich and Warwick, up that area, and he starts to browbeat people to form a militia, because after the Boston Tea Party of '73, December, then the British came in '74 and kind of took over Boston. They seized Boston. If you were trying to get into that one road on Boston Neck, you had to stop at a British checkpoint. They put ships all around it. It was a really hard and miserable place to be. And it occurred to Greene, if they can do that to Boston, Massachusetts capital city, they could do that to Newport. And we got to be prepared. We've got to have a militia group. So they petitioned the General Assembly to have a militia group. These things weren't like posses or something. They were, very well-regulated organizations of men. And the way these militias chose their officers was through elections, kind of like we would pick a town council members. And so Greene, being a charter member and who donated some money to get the group together, put in his name to run for office as an officer in the Kentish Guards, maybe a lieutenant, whatever they voted him to be. And so they counted the votes, and they said no. They didn't think that Nathanael Greene had the right stuff to be an officer in the Kentish Guards, so they made him a private. And he was, and this is 1774, and here he is a year later, a general in Princeton, Trenton and Princeton. So it's like he actually offered to resign at that point. And he said, I admitted my misfortune to limp a little. And so when the soldiers were marching, you could pick out Private Greene by the motion of the bayonet on his shoulder. You could tell him from the rest of them. He said, but I never realized there'd be such a blemish to the rest. And so he offered to resign, and his commander, General Varnum, talked him into staying. So he stayed on as a private. And he said, well, if nothing else, we will have a pretty little company to have, for mustering days, to drink some cherry bounce and have a good time, But then it soon became very clear that the Kentish Guards would be more than just a pretty little company of guys getting together once in a while, because word came in April of 1775, when Greene was out at the family forge in Coventry, a messenger came thundering up on a horse and let him know that the British had come out of Boston and they had come over to Concord to take all of the stores, the weapons, the gunpowder of the Minutemen outside of Boston. And on their way, it stopped at the Lexington Green, and there had been gunshots, and the shot heard around the world. So Greene gets on his favorite horse, Britain, and he borrows some money from a neighbor, and he thunders off from Coventry and up to East Greenwich to the Kentish Guard post there. And the army starts marching off towards Massachusetts, and the governor, Wanton, says, no, I don't want you crossing the state line, getting involved in this. Greene and a couple other guys didn't even listen to him. They kept on their horses going. But then word came down that, the shooting was over. So Greene comes back to Rhode Island, and within the next few days, he received some surprising news. The General Assembly in Rhode Island decided we need to form an army of observation. They wanted to get about 1,000 men together. And it's going to need a general. So who's going to be the general? Is it going to be Varnum? There were some others that had some experience, military experience in the French and Indian War. But they reached down into the ranks of the Kentish Guards and chose as their general Private Nathanael Greene. And why did they do that? And well, for one thing, Greene had been in the General Assembly. In Rhode Island, politics has always been very important. But I think it goes beyond that. And part of it was possibly somewhat political, in that there were two factions in this state in that time: the Ward faction of Westerly and the agrarian section, and then the Hopkins faction. One or the other was always governor up in the Providence mercantile faction. Nathanael Greene, and you can read it in his early papers here, did business with both. He worked with Brown making anchors, Brown and Hopkins making anchors for their ships, and he worked with the Wards and had a crush on Ward's daughter. So he knew the Wards. So he was somebody both factions could agree on. But I also think, You know, when the Kentish Guards were choosing their officers, it was a popularity contest. In the bookish, gimpy, asthmatic son of a Quaker preacher did not, in his own words, make a shining figure among the bucks of East Greenwich. But when the General Assembly was choosing their general, they didn't care who the most popular guy in East Greenwich was. They wanted to know who was the most capable, who was the smartest, who had experience leading. In Nathanael Greene's forge out in Coventry, it employed 100 families. He was schooled at getting product into a place, raw material, and getting, finished product out, anchors. He had experience leading people at the forge, has intelligence and connections on both sides. So the General Assembly chose Private Nathanael Greene to be their general. So Greene goes up to Boston, and he just missed Bunker Hill because he was down here recruiting, but he goes up to Boston in June of 1775, and he gets his Rhode Islanders together. And you got to picture what's going on outside of Boston at this point. The militia had come from all over New England, and they were camped outside of Boston in a 9-mile wide arc from Roxbury up to Charlestown. There were 10,000 troops, and they were a motley crew. None of them had hardly any experience in the military. And so when George Washington comes riding up as the new general of the Continental Forces in July of 1775, he rides this 9-mile arc, and there was a real culture clash. He says to himself, wrote, the New Englanders are an exceedingly nasty and dirty people. I mean, they just, there was a clash between this somewhat kind of aristocratic wannabe colonel of the Virginia militia and these New Englanders. So he rides around and he inspects his camp, and he finds one camp where the streets are all gridded out the way they're supposed to be, and the tents are warm and dry, and they have soap and rules and regulations and discipline. And that's the camp of the Rhode Islanders under Nathanael Greene. So he suggests to Congress, and they agree to make Greene the youngest brigadier general in the Continental Forces in June of 1775. So it's a pretty quick promotion from private in the Kentish Guards to brigadier general in the Continental Forces. In that 75 into 76 was they're camped outside of Boston. What are the British going to do? What are the Americans going to do? You're up there, you're living in the field. Katie delivers her first son while he's up there, his wife, and he's riding in a tent in the fall of 75, and cold came on early. He said that it's so cold that my fingers can hardly hold the pen. But he heard word of the King George's announcement that the following spring he was going to send 30,000 troops to subdue the colonies. And he said the King's announcement is really a point of no return. He says we are now under the necessity of making a declaration of independence. And in that phrase, Greene was the first one to coin the phrase, a Declaration of Independence, 7 months prior to, 9 months before that we actually adopted one. And then, of course, March of 76 comes, and that's when Henry Knox drags back a bunch of ordnance from Fort Ticonderoga. Washington sets it up on Dorchester Heights, and the British wake up one day in March and look up at all this new artillery that the Americans had up there and said, Boston isn't really that important. And it really wasn't. Boston really had no strategic importance. So the British set out, the Americans kind of won the siege of Boston, where the British set out to New York, and seeing correctly that was a far more strategic place. It controlled the Hudson River, kind of a key slot up to Canada. So the seat of the war moves from Boston to New York. And at this point, I'll just kind of quickly give you the progress of the war and then show you how Greene fits into it. So the war starts in New York, and then the British pretty much lodged beat back American attempts to try to keep New York. So the Americans have to run across New Jersey in 1776, being hounded by the British troops. It was just a terrible slog. They crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and that's where you find them in December of 1776. December 75 into 76. And, and then the Americans come back. They have that battle at Trenton and Princeton. Princeton happens on early 77. And then not much happens in the summer of 77, and the British decide, hey, we can come from New York and go over and take Pennsylvania. And when they're doing that, there's a couple of big battles there, Brandywine, Germantown. And then from those, the Americans go into camp at Valley Forge, takes you into 77, 78, and then they at Pennsylvania. And then the British come out of the camp in May of 78, chase the British across New Jersey as the British come back to New York to protect it from the French, who are now going to get involved in this whole thing. And Nathanael Greene has huge parts in all of that. His first fighting is outside of New York at Harlem Heights. He's involved in a dozen different battles. And I usually don't use superlatives, because one thing I learned as a journalist is anytime you say something's the highest, the lowest, somebody can prove you wrong. But I do say of Nathanael Greene, and nobody's ever proven me wrong, nobody enlisted or officer fought in more battles than Nathanael Greene. And what I was just talking about, he fought at Harlem Heights outside of New York. And he made a bad decision, to try to hold a fort on Manhattan Island, and that the British just easily captured a couple of thousand men, the largest loss of men and material in the war. And that kind of forced the Americans to what I talked about, that run across New Jersey over to Pennsylvania. And then they came back, and Nathanael Greene led one of the two wings into Trenton to kind of breathe new life into the war. And he also, a couple of weeks later, early 1777, led one of the American detachments going into Princeton to dislodge the British from Princeton and breathe new life into the war. So you can see wherever, pretty much anything south of Saratoga, he had a key influence in, including, as I said earlier, 1777, when the British tried to take Pennsylvania, he led, he was in charge of about 5,000 of the American troops at Brandywine. And he got them to march at the punishing pace of about 10-minute miles for a couple of miles with their 10-pound muskets in order to come and protect Washington's flank as he tried to retreat away from the British. And he saved the American bacon that day, and he led one of the columns at Germantown, Pennsylvania, before they got forced up at the Valley Forge. And at Valley Forge, this is where he really kind of earns his keep. So now it's winter of 77, 78, and the Americans have been they've lost New York, they've lost Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, the capital. They're getting beat from pillar to post, and they go into a winter encampment at Valley Forge. And their quartermaster general, the person in charge of keeping them in food and clothes and keeping them basically from dying in the winter, kind of quit on the job. He joined Congress and kind of resigned, and so nobody was doing the job. So Washington and Congress turned to Greene and said, we really need you to be the quartermaster general. We think he can do it, because he had shown at Coventry that he knew how to get stuff into and out of, a village. So I want you to be the quartermaster. And Greene says, I hate the place. He said, nobody's ever heard of a quartermaster in history. He didn't want to be the quartermaster, but he agreed he would do it. And right away, he got new harnesses made for the draft horses so they wouldn't break when they went to pull wagons. He got new roads, the roads being patched up coming into and out of Valley Forge so that they could go out to the magazines, the depots where there was food, and get horses rolling over roads, food coming in. And in that way, 1 out of 5 men who went into Valley Forge never came out. They died starvation, exposure. But the ones that did survived because Nathanael Greene did the job as quartermaster general. And they not only came out, they came out stronger in May of 1778, because once they started getting fed, and Baron von Steuben started, a whole nother story, started training them in the techniques of Prussian soldiers and line fighting, they came out of Valley Forge stronger than they went in. And they came out with some pretty good news. In fact, they liked this news so much that Washington ordered a feu de joie where everybody fired their muskets in one line. The news that they got in the spring of 1778 was the British were so impressed with Washington's stand at Germantown and with Horatio Gates's victories up at Saratoga and Bennington in New York and Vermont, that the French were so impressed with those that they would back the American cause. They would send a navy and some money and some soldiers over. And Greene said, you know, there's soldiers we don't really need, but their arms and armament we really need a lot. And they got news in Valley Forge in spring 78 that the French were going to come and aid the American cause. And the British got the same news. So they said, well, we're getting out of Philadelphia. We got to go back to New York because the French are going to show up on the coast and they're going to take New York. So as the British came across New Jersey back to New York, Washington and Greene, they came out of Valley Forge and chased them. So in 1776, the Americans were being chased across New Jersey. Now the Americans are chasing the British across New Jersey, and they engage at a place called Monmouth, New Jersey, in June of 78. And again, Greene takes one of the columns of the American right, sets up some artillery, and it is key, as for the first time in the war, American troops hold the contested ground at the end of the Battle of Monmouth. It was kind of a draw because the British's goal in the whole thing was to get to New York, and which they safely did. But at the end of that day, the Americans hadn't been chased off the ground for the first time. And then the Americans knew that they couldn't really get into New York. So where would the war go next? Rhode Island. Why not go to Rhode Island? Because the British had set up a garrison of 6,000 men on Aquidneck Island. They came in on December 7, 1776, and that just really frosted the Rhode Islanders, because here's their continental troops, their best people out fighting at Trenton and Princeton, and their capital is unprotected, and the British came waltzing in almost, unchallenged. And the General Assembly was so mad about the British troops taking over their Aquidneck Island and Newport, their capital, that they offered prizes to anybody who could capture somebody from that garrison. You get like $100, I think it was $10 if you could get a private. You get $1,000 if you get a general. And there was a guy from Warren, William Barton, who decided he'd get the $1,000. And he set up this clandestine raid where they left Warwick Neck rowing boats at night with their oars muffled by sheepskin, and they rowed over to Middletown and had intelligence, knew where General Prescott, who was in charge of this garrison of 6,000 people, was ensconced. And they snuck up, disabled the sentry, grabbed General Prescott, and stole the general out of a garrison of 6,000 people. So there's really some good stories around Rhode Island during the war. But by 78, they still had that garrison of 6,000 out there. And Greene and others convinced Washington that, well, you're not going to take New York, let's go get that garrison. And so they had a really huge war setting up to happen out there in Aquidneck Island. The French Navy was going to, seize the ocean. 10,000 militia, including an all-star famous people, Paul Revere and John Hancock, and of course Lafayette and Greene were all gathering at Newport for this big battle. Many things conspired to keep that from being a decisive big battle that it was going to be, but it was big enough. There was the siege of Newport went on for months, a month and a half anyway, August of 78, but then the battle was a big one-day affair where you could kind of call it a draw, I guess, and the Americans got off the island without getting captured, but the British still held it at the end of the day. But at that battle, Nathanael Greene led the right side, and the troops under his command were the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was the the black and Indian, segregated troops that Rhode Island had enlisted the only ones. And I hear some people now say, well, they were a little overrated that they held the line 3 times against Hessian charges. But they did. They did. I'm not saying they did it single-handedly. The 2nd Rhode Island Regiment came over, and Greene brought some artillery over. But 3 times the Hessians tried to turn the American right, held by the 1st Rhode Island, and 3 times they failed, and which enabled the American troops to get off that island without getting captured. But then the seat of the war after '78 changes, because this was the king himself, so his strategy, but it turned out to be a pretty smart one. He said, it's desultory up in the north, but down in the south, I think we could really make some progress. And we'll take over the southern states. We'll cut Virginia's the big commissary, the most wealthy province, and that will cut off the north from the south, and they'll wither away. And it's easier in the south because they're not as rabid for it. And plus the South had their own divisions, almost little civil wars going on, particularly in the Carolinas. So he said, we can go down there and we'll do it. So he deliberately, late '78, he took Savannah, Georgia. British troops came in, and Robert Howe, the British commander there, pulled the British out, the Americans out, by that great loss, pretty much lost an army at Savannah. And then in the early May of 1980, the Americans lose Charleston, the largest loss of men and material in the world. So the king's new strategy was working, right? Then he also took Camden when Horatio Gates went down there after Charleston. He was the 3rd American commander, Southern commander, to go down there. The hero of Saratoga blundered into a big trap at Camden and lost an entire American army. So since 78, 79, 80, the Americans lost 3 armies into the South, and it looked really grim. So Congress turned to Washington and said, well, we took the last Southern commanders, and it didn't work out. Why don't you pick out the next one? And they said, well, I'm going to choose Nathanael Greene. And this was in 1780, which was pretty much the nadir of the war, because he had just lost Charleston. This had been going on 5 hard years now since Lexington and Concord. People were sick of it, just like you might be getting sick of it. And to top it all off, in September 1780, Benedict Arnold is exposed as a traitor. I mean, the great Benedict Arnold, a hero of another hero of Saratoga, exposed as a traitor. So, I mean, who could you trust? You couldn't trust Arnold. The war was pretty much over. And they actually had a trial for General Arnold's accomplice, a guy named John Andre. They didn't get their hands on Arnold, but they did catch his accomplice, Andre. And Nathanael Greene was the head of the court that held Andre's trial and sentenced him to death. So there again, in the Benedict Arnold affair, here's Nathanael Greene, the Forrest Gump of the Revolution, signing off on the death warrant for John Andre. So now, the Congress turns to Greene and says, all right, you're going south. You're going to be the new commander down there. So it's this December 1780. He gets some horses and some teams together, and he rides from West Point, and he goes down to, he thinks he's going to find his army somewhere else in North Carolina, but it turns out they're in Charlotte, Charlotte is not like Charlotte today. It's like a courthouse, a couple of houses. And he finds his army camped out on swampy ground outside of a courthouse, and he sends an adjutant around to see, okay, what do we have left after losing armies, under Howe and Lincoln and Benjamin Lincoln and Gates. What do I have left? And he counts his men, and he has on paper like 2,500 people, but the adjutant comes back and he says, you have here equipped and fit for duty, people who have clothes and weapons, 800 guys. In that 3-state theater, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, his adversary, Charles Lord Cornwallis, had a field army of 4,000 camped 60 miles away from Greene. So he outnumbers Greene 5-1. But he also had the garrisons at Savannah, at Charleston, and a whole chain of outposts going through the Carolina backcountry. He had in that theater 10,000 men. So Greene is outnumbered by more than 10 to 1 by his people who were equipped and fit for duty. And I'll tell you right now, that was December 1780. By September 1781, 9 months later, Nathanael Greene had run all of those British troops out of the three-state theater, except for Charleston, and it ran Cornwallis up into a trap on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia. He did this in 10 months, it was 9 months really by the time of Utah Springs. He did it by using his brains. He was like a chess player who had just taken over from poor players who had lost most of their pieces. The guy on the other side, Cornwallis, was a grand master to the military manner born. And this gimpy, asthmatic, bookish, son of a Quaker preacher from Rhode Island had outfoxed him. And he did it by basically throwing away the books. His understanding of war was what he knew by books, but he threw away the book, basically, because the book would say, you never split your army up in the face of a superior force. But he took his 2,500 guys there, and the 1,700 riffraff, he sent down a river till he could train them up and get them supplies. His 800 best ones he sent out to western North Carolina, South Carolina, and Cornwallis saw that outpost, those 800 guys out there, decided to go pick them off with Van Tarleton's cavalry, and Dan Morgan, the head of the American cavalry, turned on them at the Broad River, and in a brilliant tactical battle, beat Cornwallis's troops. And Cornwallis gets so mad about that he said, I'm going to chase Greene, literally he said, to the ends of the earth. And he burned all his baggage, and he drained all his rum into the soil to lighten up his wagons, and he chased after Greene. Greene retreated across the Dan River, a punishing 70-mile run where he barely got across before Cornwallis could catch him, got up into Virginia, recruited new troops, militia troops, came back across the Dan and engaged Cornwallis at a place called Guilford Courthouse, where at the end of that day, in March of 1781, Greene didn't hold the ground, but he had inflicted so much punishment on Cornwallis, who was now far from his supply groups, had just lost his Van Tarleton's cavalry, lost a bunch of people at Guilford Courthouse, and said, I better get out of here. So he started going towards the coast, and Greene started in after him, and then Greene had an idea, I'm going to turn down into the Carolinas and start picking off all those outposts that he's got in the back. And again, the books would say, never put a superior force at your flank. But Greene threw away the book. He went down to the Carolinas, started with the help of the local militia groups, with Sumter and the other guy there. They started, picking off all of the outposts in the Carolinas. And Greene saved a couple of the big ones for himself, particularly in Camden, where he camped outside of Camden. And the British there said, we better go get Greene's troops up on Hobkirk's Hill. They came out, engaged Greene. Again, Greene couldn't hold the field. He withdrew. And he wrote to Lafayette, he said, we fight, get beat, rise and fight again. And that was his strategy. He could, as long as he could keep his army out in the field, keep bleeding the British who were far from, across the ocean from where they could get new people from. So he lost Camden, but when the British looked out there and said, he's still out in the woods, they burned Camden and left it and went back into Charleston. So, and then Cornwallis said, well, I'm going to go up into Virginia. And he got up on the York Peninsula, and Greene looked at that, and he realized Cornwallis had made a blunder. And he wrote in August of 1781, we have been beating the bush, and the general has come to catch the bird, because General Washington and the French troops were coming down to cinch Cornwallis off on the York Peninsula with the help of the French Navy, which they did in October 1781, basically breaking the British will to prosecute the war. So within those 9-10 months, he had one more battle at Utah Springs and beat that one there. He claimed victory. At the end of the day, he did camp on that field. So he beat the British in 9 months, and that was really where he made his fame as a journal of genius, compared, with some of the greats in history, Caesar, Scipio, Africanus. It's really one of the greatest generals ever. And so I think that you can say that my thesis that without Nathanael Greene, there's no United States of America is at least reasonable, right? Because, if he doesn't win the South, we get cut off and lose. So that's pretty much the story. I don't know if everybody has any questions about his post-war time or any, once I went down to Guilford Courthouse, National Military Park. They invited me down, and I spoke for an hour on the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And I could do that if you'd like. But I think maybe if it's time to really more, hear probe where you would like to go with this, hear what you'd like to hear about him. Yes?
He never came back to Rhode Island, correct?
Well, he did kind of try to come back to Rhode Island. Yeah, 1783. He reads he finally, I mean, the war was effectively over, at Yorktown in 1781, but not really. The British hadn't quit, so he still had to keep troops in the field, camped outside of Charleston, and he had to keep them equipped and disciplined. And but finally in 1783, he reads his final orders to his men, and somebody figured out that if you had been with him just in his southern campaigns, you would have marched 2,600 miles up and down North and South Carolina, going down and up and to right across the Dan River and then back to Guilford Courthouse. 2,600 miles, marching through those swamps and the enervating heat of summers and the frosty nights, So, but 1783, he gets to come home. His wife sails before he does. She goes up to Newport, and then finally he gets, because she had come down to live with him in Charleston for a while, finally he gets permission to go. He sails home to Newport, and Katie's home pretty pregnant, and he comes, and Greene finally arrives, carrying with him Baron von Steuben, who's broke, as is Greene. And Katie's very pregnant with kids, and everybody's sick, has whooping cough. And here comes Nathanael bringing home a house guest, But they arrive in Newport. It lives, I think it's on Spring Street. You can still see the house. So there's not a plaque on it, but at the top and to the left. And the baby, one of the kids died there. But so he gets there in Newport is wrecked. The British had occupied it, then the French occupied it, then a big war fought on it. So Rhode Island was wrecked. The British had burned Bristol and, out in Bedford Way. Rhode Island was just a mess, a war-torn mess. There wasn't a whole lot of call for anchors, plus his father had died, and he had 6 brothers and 6 families trying to live off this forage. And while he was gone, they conveniently divvied up with the inheritance, and he got the short end of the stick, a little farm in Westerly. So he's looking around, and there's no way he can really make money here. So he does sail from Newport, and for the last time sees Rhode Island for Savannah, Georgia, where the states of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina all gave him plantations, seized from loyalists, kind of as a thanks for freeing them. And he looked at all of them and he said, the best one for me making a living is this one in Savannah. It was a rice plantation. And in fact, people don't really realize this, but in 1798, a ship arrived in England with a bale of 500 pounds of cotton in it. And it said it was from the United States. And the customs agent said, this is manifest as lying. The United States doesn't make cotton. It was still a very rare thing to make. So he decided in 1783 he was going to make a go of it in rice farming down there in Savannah. And he petitioned to the General Assembly. He said that the 100 enslaved people that lived here, I want them too. I want that property. And there were people like Lafayette, Hamilton, and even a Quaker, Warner Mifflin. Warner Mifflin said to Greene, he said, if you become an enslaver of people, then it will be a stain on thy character in the annals of history. And Greene wrote back and said, there is no defense for slavery. But then he proceeded to enslave 100 people at Savannah at the growing rice. And it turned out he wasn't a very good rice farmer. He tried, but he just had bad luck. He had one ship ready to go full of rice, and it sunk in the docks. A hurricane hit his rice fields one year as they were ready for harvest and wiped it out. And then another time, an enslaved person lit a fire to keep the bobolinks, the rice birds, out, and it ran out of control, and it burned the paddy. So and meanwhile, he was living in Savannah. He was totally in debt because he had agreed to pledge his personal fortune to support his troops when he was camped outside of Charleston in 1783. There were merchants in Charleston who had British connections, but by this time the war was pretty much over, so they agreed to send to Greene's camp cloth for uniforms, soap, candles, all of the things, 30,000 pounds worth of, dollar-wise, pounds-wise, of goods. But the Army contractor who was supposed to handle this, they didn't trust John Banks. They said, we don't trust Banks. So we're not going to send this stuff out to him. And Greene said, look, I will personally pledge to pay you if you just send this stuff to my army. So they did. And then when the war was over, Greene turned to Congress and he said, well, I need the 30,000 pounds that I promised, and they said, we're broke, we haven't got any money. So Greene was on the hook. And so he's just living in Savannah. One of the debt collecting agents from the biggest merchant house kept dunning him, you owe us money, and he did. And then one of his former captains, a Georgian, wanted to challenge him to a duel because Greene wouldn't let him take his horses home. So the poor guy, he's living down there in Charleston, with his hurricanes and flood and fires, and a guy wants to shoot him, and somebody else is trying to get money out of him. And then he finally is making a deal with the bill collector, who's going to work out his bills. And as he's coming back from town from meeting that guy, he stops at a neighboring rice plantation to visit it, and he gets kind of a stroke, and he goes home, and over the course of the next couple of days, he dies at the age of 43, leaving Katie, a widow, at Mulberry Grove with 5 of their surviving kids, and the tutor, Phineas Miller. And the tutor, Phineas Miller, had a neighboring plantation owner liked him and said, I want a tutor too, do you know anybody? And Miller had gone to Yale, so he wrote to Yale, and they said, well, this is a guy, Eli Whitney. He'll come down. So Whitney came down to be a teacher at the neighboring plantation, and Katie Greene liked Eli and said, why don't you stay with us? And so he did. He'd go into Katie's shed and he'd tinker around making toys for Katie's kids. And then, this is a true story, and one night in the parlor there, at Mulberry Grove, he heard the rice plantation, rice farmers talking about if they only could get the seeds out of cotton, it would really be a popular thing. And so he went in and he started tinkering around in Katie's shed to make a cotton engine, the cotton gin. And he was stuck, and Katie said, well, try my brush. And he took her brush, and he said, oh, no, and he made it a comb. But he invented the cotton engine. And finally, Katie did convince Congress to pay back Greene's estate for the money that he had pledged and actually paid. And so she got some money, and she was like an 18th century venture capitalist. She backed the firm of Miller and Whitney, Phineas Miller, in the production of the first cotton gins. So you can see that they had quite an effect on history, because it wasn't that much longer between that technology and the Indian removal that under Jackson that pushed Cherokee and other Indians off of the bottomland of the Delta, that now all of a sudden you had in America kind of became what Saudi Arabia was to oil, we were to cotton, and it was, you know, so they really changed the course of history down there. Yeah, I guess you asked if you ever came back to Rhode Island. Yeah. Yes, Chris.
Can you talk a little bit about Katie and how we met her and where she came from?
Well, yeah, okay, his wife Katie was a Block Island girl, right? And but she was about 7 years old when her mother died, and her father sent her off island to live in East Greenwich up on Love Lane, house that's still there. And her aunt was also named Katie. And I guess they looked a lot alike, and she really the aunt really turned the head of Ben Franklin, who they kind of hit on her, but it was a platonic. They had there's a book of letters between Katie's aunt and Ben Franklin came to visit on Love Lane a couple of times, you know, and they lived there. And as we were talking earlier, Chris, the census does show that Katie's aunt had enslaved some people in that house. So the institution of slavery certainly wouldn't have been unusual to Katie. But she was living there with Aunt Katie, and you can tell from these letters as you read them. I mean, this book, there are 13 volumes of them. They're wonderfully written. Greene's a good writer. But you can see that Katie and her aunt really didn't get along. They were often at loggerheads on various things. I think Katie was kind of a wild child. And I guess she was about 16 during the time of the Gaspee affair. And Nathanael was a dozen years older than her. And that's when they first laid eyes on her, because he was staying at the Katie Ray Greene's house on Love Lane during some of that trial. And then a few years after that, they got married, and he was 12 years older than her, and their relationship was tempestuous. You know, but loving. She was quite a character. I mean, you can see that General Washington was smitten by her. You know, they had, and Greene didn't really like parties, and she did, and they were having a party at Morristown in a winter encampment, and she danced with General Washington upwards of 3 hours at that party, and you know, so, and I kind of have a theory about her that she might, and this is, you can't prove it, it's just psychobabble. I think she might have been manic depressive, you know, and I think that when she was manic, she kind of would act out sexually. And the last kid they had that survived, you can do the math, and you know, as I said, in 1783 she left Charleston. And then he left Charleston, and then he was waiting for her to put to bed, as he put it, with a baby. And unless if you believe a gestation period of like 300 days, like longer than an elephant, you know it wasn't his baby. And he could do the math, and he knew it wasn't his baby. But you know what? By that time, he had seen so much, and he, you know, he did love her. They you know, she came to various war camps to see, and they stayed together. But yeah, she was I loved the time at Morristown when they were having one of these parties, and General Washington was going to come in and capture this woman's husband, because the guy was a teetotaler, and they said, "Oh, you're going to come drink with us," and the guy, and it was all good natured, you know, "You're going to come have a drink with the men," and he was like, "I don't drink," and it was, "Oh yeah, you're a prisoner of war, you're going to drink with us." And the guy's wife, I can't remember his last name, is in Rhode Island, though, got up and said, though you may be a general, you are but a man. And she was going to attack Washington, and Katie flew at her. And they had this big fight, and it's really a funny exchange of letters going back and forth, you know, of this incident in Morristown. So it wasn't all fighting and and freezing, you know. But yeah, no, Katie was a real character, and you know, and she married her tutor who was 12, who was a dozen years younger than her. So her second husband was 22 years younger than her first husband. And then he died of blood poisoning or something. He pricked his finger on a thorn, in those days, no antibiotics. And
Did she get wealthy?
and she didn't get wealthy. The cotton engine thing was, it was such an easy thing to rip off, an easy design, that, they did, her company, Miller and Whitney, spent a lot of money on patent suits and won a lot of them, but they didn't make a lot of money off that. And what they did have, they invested in something called the Yazoo Land Scheme, which turned out to be kind of a scam, but Congress ended up saying, no, that's too much of a scam, you can't do it. So they lost their money in the Yazoo Land Scheme. So eventually, she ended up going out to Nathanael Greene's house on Cumberland Island, Georgia. The Army contractor, John Banks, who stiffed the people in there, Greene sued his estate for debt, and his estate had owned Cumberland Island, Georgia. Had a lot of oak on it, live oak, and he thought maybe he could make some money off that. And there was a big house out there that he went and moved his family there for a while. And after he died, Katie went from Mulberry Grove up to Cumberland Island, and that's where she died and is buried today. And at one point, after he shot Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr wanted to go visit her there. And he wrote a letter saying, I'm coming to see you. And he said, well, you can come, but I'm not going to be here, because she didn't want to see him after so he didn't end up going. But so yeah, so she had, she knew Washington. In fact, Washington went out of his way to pay a visit to her at Mulberry Grove. You have Washington and his coaching four and all of his, bodyguards coming riding out to Mulberry Grove to see Katie. So of course she knew Lafayette. Lafayette, a real close friend of Greene's, and after Greene died, took his first son, George Washington Greene, and raised him with his own in France. Unfortunately, George Washington Greene, at the age of 18, built a homemade canoe and swamped it in the Savannah River and drowned. At age 18. That was after Nathaniel's death, but this poor Katie, loses her husband, loses her oldest son. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And when you think of Nathanael Greene, look what he gave up, right? I mean, he died young, 43, and I think it's because of the war exacted a toll on his health. I mean, he in Washington, Knox went home during Valley Forge. Greene and Washington are the only ones who served the entire thing. And I can tick off, but it would bore you, the 11 battles that Nathanael Greene fought, and nobody else fought in 11 battles, plus 2 sieges, Siege of Boston and Siege of 96. So he was spent, so the war cost him his health. It definitely affected his family life, I mean, he's got this young wife who at one point wrote to one of her paramours, "It's like I am in a widowed state," Jeremiah Wordsworth, when she was living in Wesley on her own. Kind of flirting with Jeremiah, So, it cost his marriage, cost him his fortune, cost him his money. It's just about everything, he didn't die in the war. Maybe if he had, would remember him more, So he gave all. He gave it all. And I'm not inclined to give it back too easy now. Yeah. You guys are probably afraid to ask a question because I'm like one of those people, you say something and then I go on for another 10 minutes. But where are we at time, Lisa?
Well, South Carolina came out with a license plate recently and said, South Carolina, where the Revolutionary War was won.
I believe that. One thing, it's funny, and I was telling this to last week, the Round Historical Society hired me to talk to Round school teachers. Elementary school, high school teachers, and I said to them, and I'll say to you now, it seems to me we have a very northern-centric view of the war. And the way I remember learning it up in Georgetown, Massachusetts, north of Boston, was, guys in tri-cornered hats pop out behind the walls at Lexington Concord, boom, 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 siege of Boston, Yorktown, and it's over, But really, the majority, from 1775 through 78, you had a lot of fighting up here. After that, the last battle of any size fought in the North was Nathanael Greene led it at Springfield, New Jersey in 1779, and held the ground at the end of the day. You go out of his one victory. So 1779, everything else for until 1783 happened down there. The big ones happened down there. Yorktown happened down there. And the battles that Greene was in, like the one I talked for an hour at Guilford Courthouse Military Park, that is the seminal battle in the United States. Cowpens, where I was talking about, Dan Morgan picking off Towton's cavalry out at the Cowpens in South Carolina. These are major events. And never mind all the little skirmishes going on between Francis Marion's troops and those partisans down there, Thomas Sumter. And that's what kills me too. I was talking at Barrington High School, good school, and I looked at their textbook. This was a few years ago, and it says, it's reading about the Revolution, and there's a little, like a pulled out box paragraph about Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, and then one sentence to mention Nathanael Greene, right? And I'm like, Francis Marion couldn't carry Nathanael Greene's musket. He was a partisan working with, almost. A lot of times, too, people think of the war as using guerrilla tactics, and it really didn't. All of the big battles, all the Greene's battles, they were line formations, pitched battles. And Greene and Washington knew you're not going to win a war with a bunch of little partisan, guerrilla actions here and there. It's going to require putting a force in the field, keeping a force in the field. So that license plate, South Carolina, where the war was won, I kind of believe that. And I think the one that won it was Nathanael Greene. And like I said earlier, Greene was a better general than Washington. I was kind of half joking, because at the beginning of the war, at Boston, we had an army out there that was in its infancy, right? It couldn't clothe itself. It couldn't feed itself. It couldn't even go to the bathroom without making a mess. Washington had to show them how to dig latrines. And Washington knew this because he had been a colonel in the French and Indian War, with the British militia. So he came up here and he made a fighting force when Greene couldn't have done that. So it took a Southerner to come to the North and save the North, and it took a Northerner, a Rhode Islander, to go to the South, and save the South. Because Washington couldn't have done. I think he was too aggressive by nature, and he would have just run into things the way Gates did down there, whereas Greene was just a brilliant strategist. And if you look at volume 7 and 8 of these papers, he has to write to Washington to tell him what he's doing, because Washington can't help him. If he writes a letter to Washington, if it gets through at all, it takes 6 weeks. And then Washington writes back to him, that's another 6 weeks. So it's 3 months. He can't be asking Washington for advice. But he felt an obligation to at least tell Washington what he was doing and why. And so when he's explaining his strategy of the Southern campaigns in volume 7 and 8 of the papers, it's like you can get behind his eyes and look out and see the topography, because he was meticulous about where the rivers are, and see, I'm going to do this, I'm going to turn into the Carolinas, and that will force Cornwallis to either chase me or to run up into, it was just, and it's great, it's brilliant. And so and that is where I think the war was won, was in the South from, after Savannah fell in 78 to Yorktown in 81. That's where the seed of the fighting was. That's where the crux of it happened. We were in on the beginning, but they ended it. Yeah. So what else do we want to know about Nathanael and Katie? And I hope that you can at least agree that the statement, as you say, you can't conclusively prove that without Greene there's no United States. But I hope, as I said at the beginning, you can at least say it's a reasonable hypothesis.
Sure is.
Thank you.
That was wonderful, fascinating. We have another talk coming up on the life and times of Oliver Hazard Perry. January on April 23rd. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for coming.